Hi guys, this is part 2 of a 3-part video tutorial on making an easy peasy baby blanket. So part 1 is how to knit your tubes, part 2 is finishing the tube ends and seaming the tubes together, and part 3 is a crochet border. So there are a few things that I do a little different to align stripes or patterns on both sides of the blanket. In part 1, I showed you how to make the tubes. This includes starting the tube at the number 1 location and using a jogless color change at the number 2 location and ending your tube at the number 1 location. So let me show you how to finish the tube ends and seam them together. Step 1 is finishing the first stitch on the cast-on edge. You only need to do this on the cast-on edge. You can see how the tail comes out through the top instead of down through the bottom. To fix this, follow the waste yarn tail through the last 2 loops and insert your hook into these loops. Pull the tail through the 2 loops. Then you can remove the waste yarn from these same 2 loops. Now this end is ready to slip stitch closed. This is an important step because it will align your column of stitches from one end to the other for seaming. Count over half the number of needles on your machine. For example, I'm using a 46 needle machine and I'll count over 23 stitches from the tail stitch, not including the tail stitch. Then I'll insert the hook into the 23rd stitch and then into the following stitch and pull that stitch through. Now pick up the next stitch on the top and pull through, then the next stitch on the bottom and pull through. Continue to alternate between the top and the bottom until the end. You'll notice that I'm pulling the stitch on the hook over the stitch that is being pulled through. If you pull too hard, the following stitches become smaller and harder to find. This can result in missing stitches that will unravel after the waste yarn is removed. When you reach the end, you can pull the last stitch all the way through. Then you can remove the waste yarn. And this is the finished edge. Now you can finish the opposite end the same way. The next step is to align the tube tails and mark the columns to be seamed. I've already seamed the other 4 tubes together, and I'll place that section on the bottom with the tail coming off the top corner. Then place the last tube so that the cast-on edge, or the yellow end, is on the left with the tails coming off the top side. We'll start seaming where the aqua to white meet, and then we'll work our way to the left. Before we can do that, find the corner column of stitches. This column will look like V-stitches that open to the top edge or to the left. Follow this column of stitches down and place a stitch marker near the starting point. Then continue to follow this column all the way to the opposite end, just to be sure that it aligns in the corner. Now do the same on the top tube. Again, find the corner column of V-stitches, follow it down, and place a stitch marker in the aqua color. Next, what I do is I pinch these two edges together and align the tube so that it's easy to start seaming. So cut the seaming yarn about 2 times the length of the tube and thread onto a tapestry needle. So I'm going to use the yellow as my seaming yarn. So this is the column of stitches that we are going to use for seaming. We've marked it with our stitch marker, and you'll notice that the stitches, the V stitches, open to the left on both tubes. So to begin, insert your needle into the second aqua stitch and find the first 2 aqua bars. So one stitch will be aqua and the other will be white. The 2 bars will both be aqua. And then pull the yarn about halfway through. Then go to the other tube and insert your needle into the last 2 white stitches. And what you'll find is the last white bar and the first aqua bar. And then pull that tail through. So go back to the bottom side and insert your needle into the previous stitch, and we're going to pick up 2 bars and pull the yarn through. Back to the top side, insert your needle into the previous stitch and pick up 2 bars and pull the yarn through. So continue to alternate between the top and the bottom, going into the previous stitch and picking up 2 bars at a time. After a few inches of seaming, pull the tails tight to close up the seam. And you can see that it aligns perfectly. Now continue to seam until you reach about 1.5 inches from the end. So you're alternating sides, going through the previous stitch, picking up 2 bars, and pulling the tail through. When you're about 1.5 inches from the end, pick up 1 bar at a time. I think this aligns the edge better than 2 bars at a time. So I started seaming on the bottom side, so I will begin my 1 bar at a time, starting with the bottom tube. Think of stitches in pairs. What you do to the bottom side, you should do to the top side to keep the seaming even. When you reach the end, do not secure your tails just yet. We will do this later. Now that we've finished, pull on the starting tail so that you have about an 8-inch tail on this end. Then turn your work and continue to seam to the opposite end. I don't recommend picking up more than 2 stitches at a time. I find that this leaves a bigger hole than I like in the seam. If you're not lining up the stripes, you can go back and unstitch a few stitches and then pick up 1 bar on one side and 2 on the other in order to align the stripe. You'll notice that the column of stitches is now pointing to the right since we turned our work. Continue to seam until you reach about 1.5 inches from the end. Like the opposite end, pick up 1 bar at a time to the end. Now I started on the bottom tube, but since we turned our work, the bottom tube is now the top side. So I'll start with the top tube and seam in 1 bar pairs till the end. After the seaming is finished, we need to stretch the seam so that when we're using the blanket, the seam stretches with the rest of the blanket. To do that, I'm just going to pull on the fabric where that seam is and just go from end to end. You can see here how that seam moved, and I'm just going to keep stretching it out, and then I'll go back the other way. And then when that's done, I'll trim the tails to about an 8 or 10-inch length. To secure the tails, we're going to thread the slip stitch tail on a tapestry needle. So here's our seaming tail. I'm just going to slide that to the back. This is my seaming tail, and I'm going to place this on a tapestry needle. So to start, I'm going to go to the opposite side and find the first stitch and insert my needle from the front to the back underneath this first stitch. Then I'll go back to the other side and insert my needle front to back under the first stitch. And then go through the same stitch that we went through before on the other side. Now I'll just weave this tail so that it comes out in the same location as the other tail, where I'll just tie a knot and then bury those tails in the knitting. So one last tail is this one at the end of the tube. I'm just going to pick up a stitch on the edge and make a simple knot and then bury that tail in the knitting as well. So I'll show you how to secure these tails again. I think this color might be a little easier on the eyes to see what I'm doing. So again, I'm picking up the seaming stitch, the slip stitch tail, and I'm going to go underneath the first stitch on the opposite side of where my tail is coming out, front to back. And then I'll go to the other side and go underneath the first set of stitches from front to back, and then back through the same stitch on the opposite side. Weave the tail so that it's close to the other tail, secure with a knot, and bury the tails in the knitting. And for the last tail, I will go underneath the first stitch, make a simple knot, and bury the tail. So this is how it looks. This is the back side, and you can see where the joins are, but it is very minimal. And the front side is virtually seamless. So part 2 is finished, and I showed you how to slip stitch the ends closed, how to align the tails and mark the columns that you need to seam. We started at a color change and seamed to the end. Then we turned our work and seamed to the opposite end. We secured and buried all the tails. Now we are ready to add a crochet border, so stay tuned for that video. It's coming up next. This easy peasy blanket pattern is now in my Etsy and Ravelry shops. It includes this baby size along with a throw and 3 bed sizes. Thanks for watching.